Claire Hartley was living a seemingly perfect life. Married to a decorated army officer, she had all the trappings of a dream life, a beautiful home, wealth, and status. But beneath the surface, Claire was a woman slowly drowning in isolation and boredom. David, her husband, was a man who loved his career more than anything else, including her. His long deployments left Claire alone for weeks, sometimes months at a time, and even when he was home, his mind was on the battlefield. It was at a charity gala that Claire met Greg Mathis, a charming and attentive man who was everything her husband was not. Greg, a journalist covering international affairs, was in town temporarily and had been invited to the event as a guest speaker. From the moment their eyes met across the room, something sparked between them. Greg's intense gaze lingered on Claire, and she too felt an inexplicable pull toward him. Their first conversation was electric, filled with subtle flirtations and laughter that Claire hadn't experienced in years. Greg listened to her in a way David never did, hanging on her every word as if she were the most fascinating person in the world by the end of the night. They exchanged phone numbers under the pretense of discussing some upcoming charity work, but both knew it was more than that. It was the beginning of something dangerous, a temptation neither could resist. Over the following weeks, Greg became Claire's secret indulgence. They texted constantly, sharing intimate thoughts and experiences, their conversations growing more personal and suggestive with each passing day. What started as innocent banter quickly morphed into something much more intense. Greg's words ignited a passion in Claire that had long been dormant, a flame that David had unknowingly let die over the years. Soon, their text exchanges weren't enough. Claire craved more. She needed to see him, to feel the electricity that had sparked between them at the gala one afternoon. She made an excuse to leave the house and met Greg at a cozy coffee shop on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. They sat across from each other, and the air between them was charged with an undeniable tension. Claire's heart raced as they talked, their knees brushing under the table, their eyes locked in a silent understanding of what was to come when Greg reached across the table and gently touched her hand. Claire felt a jolt of desire course through her. The touch was innocent enough, but the look in his eyes was anything but. That moment marked the beginning of their affair, a whirlwind of secret meetings, stolen kisses, and a growing bond that made Claire feel more alive than she had in years. As the affair progressed, Claire and Greg's connection grew stronger, both emotionally and physically. What began as casual flirtation had blossomed into a full-blown romance, one that consumed them both. They met in clandestine locations, hotel rooms, parks, and even Greg's small downtown apartment, always careful to stay out of sight, always aware of the risk. Their time together was intoxicating. In Greg's arms, Claire felt desired in a way she hadn't in years. He made her feel beautiful, important, and needed all the things she'd been craving from her husband but never received. Each touch, each kiss set her on fire, making her forget everything but the way Greg's hands felt on her skin and the way his lips traced the contours of her body. Their lovemaking was intense and passionate, filled with the kind of raw, uninhibited desire that Claire had long thought she'd lost. Greg worshipped her, his every touch filled with a hunger that matched her own. In those stolen moments, all the guilt and fear melted away, leaving only the heat of their bodies and the desperate need to consume one another. Greg, too, was swept up in the intensity of their affair. He was captivated by Claire's elegance, her vulnerability, and the deep sadness he sensed beneath her polished exterior. He wanted to rescue her from the loneliness he knew she felt to be the one who made her smile again. Their affair became his obsession, a forbidden pleasure that he couldn't give up, no matter the consequences. Claire's marriage to David, once strained but stable, began to crumble under the weight of her secret. As her affair with Greg deepened, her relationship with David became more distant. He was often away on deployments, but even when he was home, the emotional gap between them was undeniable. Claire found herself resenting David for his dedication to the army, for the way he seemed to prioritize his career over their marriage. She blamed him for the loneliness she felt for driving her into Greg's arms. David, on the other hand, began to sense something was wrong. Claire had always been distant when he returned from his deployments, but this time it felt different. She was distracted, always on her phone, and seemed disinterested in the life they had built together. David, ever the stoic soldier, kept his suspicions to himself, but the tension in their home was palpable. Claire's lies grew more frequent. She made excuses to meet Greg, telling David she was going to yoga or a book club, when in reality, she was slipping away to be with her lover. Each lie added to the growing sense of unease, but Claire couldn't stop herself. She was addicted to the thrill of the affair, to the way Greg made her feel. The more distant David became, the more she leaned into her relationship with Greg, seeking solace in his arms. It was on a weekend trip to the countryside that things began to spiral. David, sensing the growing rift between them, had planned the trip as a way to reconnect, to salvage what was left of their marriage. But Claire, already deeply involved with Greg, saw the trip as a burden, a reminder of the life she no longer wanted. They stayed in a charming cottage surrounded by nature, but the idyllic setting did little to soothe the tension between them. Over dinner, David tried to engage Claire in conversation. But her mind was elsewhere on Greg, on their last passionate encounter, on the life she was beginning to envision without David. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unresolved anger. That night, after another failed attempt at intimacy, Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with thoughts of Greg, of the future they could have together. If only she had the courage to leave David, but the thought of divorce seemed impossible. David was a powerful man with influential connections, and the consequences of leaving him would be severe. Still, the desire to be with Greg was overwhelming, and Claire began to consider more drastic solutions. The tension in their marriage finally boiled over one evening, a few days after they returned from the trip. David, who had been quietly observing Claire's behavior for weeks, finally confronted her. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of anger as he asked her where she had been earlier that day. Claire, feeling cornered, lied again, telling him she had been at a friend's house for a book club meeting. But David wasn't convinced. He had noticed the changes in her behavior, the late nights, the mysterious phone calls, the distance in her eyes. He accused her of having an affair, and for the first time, Claire felt truly afraid. She denied it, of course, but the damage was done. David's suspicion had turned into certainty, and their fragile marriage was now hanging by a thread. Greg, meanwhile, had become more possessive. What had started as a casual affair had turned into an all-consuming obsession. He wanted more from Claire, more time, more commitment, and ultimately, a life together. He began to pressure her to leave David, to run away with him and start a new life, free from the constraints of her marriage. Claire, torn between her passion for Greg and the life she had built with David, hesitated. She wasn't ready to abandon everything, but the thought of staying with David, trapped in a loveless marriage, was equally unbearable. Greg's insistence only fueled her internal conflict, and soon their affair took a darker turn. One evening, after a particularly heated night of passion, Greg proposed a solution that chilled Claire to the core. They were lying in bed, their bodies tangled together, when Greg whispered the words that would change everything. What if David wasn't in the picture anymore? At first, Claire thought he was joking, but the look in his eyes told her otherwise. Greg's obsession with her had reached a dangerous level, and he was willing to do anything to have her all to himself. He suggested they find a way to get rid of David. An accident, perhaps, or something that would make it look like self-defense. Claire, horrified by the idea, refused. She couldn't imagine taking a life, let alone her husband's. No matter how much she wanted to be with Greg. But the seed had been planted, and over the following weeks, the thought of escaping her marriage became more and more tempting. Despite her initial shock at Greg's suggestion, Claire found herself unable to shake the idea. It gnawed at her, a dark and forbidden thought that lingered in the back of her mind. The more she tried to suppress it, the more it consumed her. Every time David touched her or spoke to her, Claire's resentment grew, and she found herself fantasizing about a life without him, about freedom, about being with Greg. Greg, sensing her hesitation, began to push harder. He told Claire that they couldn't continue living in secrecy, that their love deserved to be out in the open. The pressure weighed heavily on Claire, and soon she began to wonder if maybe Greg was right. Maybe there was no way out of this mess without drastic measures, but the thought of murder terrified her, and she still clung to the hope that somehow she could escape without resorting to such extremes. However, Claire's descent into darkness was inevitable. As the weeks passed, the line between right and wrong blurred, and her once clear moral compass became clouded by her desire for Greg. She stopped seeing David as her husband and began to see him as an obstacle, something standing between her and the life she wanted. In the midst of her emotional turmoil, Claire and Greg's affair reached new heights of intensity. Their meetings became more frequent, more passionate, and more reckless. They couldn't keep their hands off each other, their need for one another overpowering any sense of caution they might have had. Greg's possessiveness grew, and Claire, fueled by the thrill of their illicit love, found herself rendering completely to him. One evening, they met at Greg's apartment after weeks of near-constant contact. As soon as Claire walked through the door, Greg pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a ferocity that left her breathless. His hands roamed her body, pulling her closer as they stumbled into the bedroom, the air thick with desire. They fell onto the bed, their clothes discarded in a frenzied rush. And for the next few hours, they lost themselves in one another. Greg's touch was demanding, his kisses filled with a hunger that matched Claire's own. She had never felt so alive, so wanted, and as they made love, the rest of the world faded away. In Greg's arms, there were no consequences, no guilt, only the raw, primal need to be with him. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets. Their bodies slick with sweat, Greg traced lazy circles on Claire's bare back, his voice soft as he whispered promises of a future together. "We can be free, Claire. You just have to take that final step." But even in the haze of their passion, Claire felt a shiver of fear at his words. She wasn't ready for what Greg was asking of her, and yet the temptation to give in was growing stronger by the day. As the days passed, Claire found herself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Her time with Greg was intoxicating, but each moment they spent together only deepened her guilt. She had become a master of deception, lying to David with increasing ease. But the weight of her infidelity was beginning to crush her. She would return home after her trysts with Greg, her body still tingling from their lovemaking, only to be met by David's tired smile. He had no idea that while he had been working to support their life together, his wife had been giving herself to another man. The guilt gnawed at her, but not enough to make her stop. Each time she saw Greg, the passion between them reignited and the guilt faded into the background, replaced by desire. Their affair had become an addiction, one that neither of them could quit, no matter the cost. Greg was no longer just a lover. He was her escape, her salvation from a life of suffocating boredom and neglect. But with every passionate encounter, the reality of their situation grew darker. The more time they spent together, the more Greg pushed for them to take action. He wanted Claire to leave David to be with him fully, and without the need for secrecy. And though Claire craved that freedom, the thought of what they would have to do to achieve it terrified her. The turning point came one evening when Claire and Greg met at a secluded hotel on the outskirts of town. They had been more careful lately, knowing that David's suspicions were growing, but their need for each other made them reckless as they lay together in the dim light of the hotel room. Greg once again brought up the idea of getting rid of David. "Why are we still hiding?" Greg asked, his voice low and serious. "You know we can't keep doing this forever. David's going to find out eventually. And when he does, what then?" Claire's heart raced at his words. She had tried to push the idea out of her mind, but Greg's persistence made it impossible to ignore. He was right. David wasn't a fool. And if he hadn't already figured out the truth, it was only a matter of time before he did. Greg sat up, his eyes locking onto hers. "We can be together, Claire, for real, but you have to make a choice." Claire felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. She wanted to be with Greg more than anything, but the idea of leaving David, of killing him, was something she couldn't bring herself to face. She turned away, pulling the sheet around her naked body as if it could shield her from the reality of their situation. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I can't." But Greg wasn't willing to take no for an answer. His obsession with Claire had reached a dangerous level, and he was no longer content to be the secret lover. He wanted more. He wanted all of her. The affair, once a thrilling escape, was now spiraling out of control. Claire could feel the walls closing in on her, the weight of her lies crushing her more each day. Greg's demands were becoming more insistent, and her guilt over betraying David was growing unbearable. David, meanwhile, had become increasingly suspicious. He could sense that something was wrong, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Claire had always been distant when he returned from his deployments, but this time the distance felt more permanent, more deliberate. One night, after weeks of growing tension, David confronted Claire. He had found one of her text messages to Greg, a brief but incriminating message that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Claire's heart sank as she realized that the web of lies she had spun was beginning to unravel. David's voice was cold, his eyes filled with anger and hurt. "Who is he?" he demanded, his fists clenched at his sides. "How long have you been lying to me?" Claire, caught off guard, could only stammer in response. She had never intended for things to go this far, but now that the truth was out, there was no turning back. David's anger was palpable, and for the first time, Claire feared what he might do. In the wake of David's confrontation, Claire was left reeling. The life she had built was crumbling around her, and she didn't know how to stop it. Greg, ever the manipulator, saw this as his opportunity to finally push Claire over the edge. He called her the next day, his voice calm but insistent. "This is it, Claire. He knows. If you don't act now, you'll lose everything." Claire was torn. She had never imagined her life would come to this, a choice between her husband and her lover, between the life she had always known and the one she craved. But Greg was right. David knew the truth, and sooner or later, everything would come crashing down. In a moment of desperation, Claire agreed to meet Greg. They talked for hours, plotting, planning, until they came up with a solution, one that would free Claire from her marriage and allow her to be with Greg once and for all. The plan was simple, or at least that's what Greg made it seem. They would wait for David to come home from his latest deployment, then stage a robbery gone wrong. Claire would play the grieving widow, the victim of a tragic crime, and no one would ever suspect her of being involved. Claire was terrified, but Greg's confidence soothed her fears. He made it sound so easy, so foolproof, and in her desperation to escape the life she no longer wanted, Claire convinced herself that it was the only way. But as the day of the plan approached, Claire's doubts began to creep in. She loved Greg, but the thought of taking a life, David's life, was something she couldn't fully come to terms with. Every time she looked at David, she felt a pang of guilt. But then she would remember Greg's words. "We can be free, Claire. We just have to take that final step." On the night of the crime, Claire's nerves were frayed. She had spent the entire day in a state of barely contained panic, second-guessing every decision that had led her to this point. But Greg was calm, methodical. Reassuring her that everything would go according to plan, David arrived home late, exhausted from his deployment. Claire greeted him with a forced smile, her heart pounding in her chest. Every moment felt surreal, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. David kissed her on the cheek and sat down at the kitchen table, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. Greg was waiting just outside the house. His presence, a dark shadow in Claire's mind. She had left the back door unlocked, as they had planned, and now all that was left was for Greg to make his move. Claire poured David a glass of wine, her hands trembling as she tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She could barely meet his eyes, knowing that this would be the last time she saw him alive. The minutes stretched on like hours. Each tick of the clock, a reminder that time was running out. And then, just as Claire was about to lose her nerve, she heard the faint sound of the back door opening. Greg was inside. Everything happened in a blur. One moment, David was sipping his wine, completely unaware of the danger he was in, and the next, Greg was standing behind him, a gun in his hand. Claire's heart stopped as she watched the scene unfold, her mind screaming for her to stop this madness, but her body frozen in place. David turned, confusion and shock flickering across his face as he saw Greg standing there. "What the hell?" he started to say, but the words were cut off by the deafening crack of the gunshot. David slumped forward, his glass of wine shattering on the floor as his body hit the table. Claire's scream caught in her throat, her entire world shattering in an instant. She stared at David's lifeless body, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Greg stood over him, his expression cold and detached, as if he had just taken out the trash rather than a human life. "Claire." Greg's voice snapped her out of her daze. "We have to move now." In the days that followed, Claire went through the motions of grief, playing the role of the devastated widow with chilling precision. She attended David's funeral, her face pale and tear-streaked, while friends and family gathered around her, offering their condolences. No one suspected a thing. Greg, too, was careful. He had staged the scene to look like a home invasion, wiping down surfaces and leaving just enough evidence to lead the police on a wild goose chase. For a while, it seemed as though their plan had worked perfectly. But beneath the surface, Claire was unraveling. The guilt, the horror of what she had done, consumed her every waking moment. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't escape the image of David's body slumped over the table, the sound of the gunshot echoing in her mind. Greg, on the other hand, seemed unaffected, his only concern being when they could finally be together. As the weeks went on, Claire's guilt became unbearable. She began to distance herself from Greg, unable to look at him without feeling sick. Their once passionate affair had turned into something twisted and grotesque, a reminder of the dark path they had taken together. One night, unable to sleep, Claire sat in the living room, staring at the spot where David had died. The weight of her actions crushed her, and for the first time she realized that there was no escape from the guilt. She had destroyed her life, her marriage, and any chance of happiness she might have had. In a moment of clarity, Claire made a decision. She couldn't live with the lie any longer. She went to the police, her heart pounding as she confessed everything. Her affair with Greg, their plan to kill David, the murder. She didn't care what happened to her. She just wanted the truth to come out. Greg was arrested the next day, his cold demeanor finally cracking as the reality of their situation hit him. Claire, too, was taken into custody, but for the first time in months, she felt a sense of relief. The truth was out, and though her life was ruined, at least she could stop living a lie as she sat in her prison cell. Waiting for the trial that would determine her fate, Claire thought about David. She would never be able to make up for what she had done, but in confessing, she had taken the first step toward atonement. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to find some semblance of peace in the end. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.